Welcome everybody for our annual lecture as part of the post-carbon transition program of the Oxford Martin School. Today it's an absolute pleasure for me and for all of us, I suspect, to welcome Chris Stark, the Chief Executive of the committee, the Climate Change Committee, not the Committee on Climate Change. Chris has been in that role since April. He's been doing a phenomenal job. Those of you who know him and see him will agree with me, I'm sure, after having had a glittering career in the Scottish Government as Director of Energy and Climate Change, and also 10 years in Whitehall, including some time in the Treasury. So we're very pleased to have Chris with us today for this lecture. Chris, as many of you will know, has just launched with his able team at the Climate Change Committee the 6th carbon budget in December, which sets out, very specifically, how we're going to manage the period from 2033 to 2037, so basically 2035. That's how I think of these things. And as also, it's been the first net zero budget, the first budget since that net zero target was enshrined into law. So there's a lot of very substantial analysis and great points in that, and we'll hear from Chris shortly. And I just want to say, we at Oxford have had a little bit of involvement in the CCC's work, inputting through both the policy advisory group, which I chaired, and through the group working on finance, which Ben Caldecott was involved in. So we're delighted, Chris, to have you here today. And I'm going to hand the floor to you to take us through the 6th carbon budget report. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Cameron. And thank you for your support as well in the process of bringing this together. And you spoke at one of our own events this week, so this is me returning the favour, I suppose. And I'll just bring up some slides, but while I do, I'll just say something about the CCC, because it's quite an unusual institution, I think. Cameron, maybe you can just confirm you can see that, and then I'll keep talking.
Yep, looking good. Beaming in from Glasgow without a hitch.
Lovely. Yeah, so the Climate Change Committee, and Cameron, happily you stumbled over our name because we've changed it recently to what most people know us as. So our formal name is the Committee on Climate Change. You'll see that in the Climate Change Act. But this year, or rather in the last 12 months, slightly zhuzhed up the look of the CCC a little and changed it to the name that most people know us by, the Climate Change Committee, still the CCC, which seems to trip off the tongue a little better. But we've been around since 2008. Doing, I think, a really important job for the UK, acting as the independent advisor on climate change. So today we'll be talking about emissions reduction. We also have another role on advising on the climate risks that the UK faces and how well adapted we are to them. And I'll say a little bit about that, but not very much today. But yeah, 13 years now this year we'll have been doing this job. And we've become a really important part of the apparatus because we were set up by the Climate Change Act to provide this role, which we've now been doing pretty successfully, I think, for a while now. This work that we will talk about today is very much the culmination of 10 years of looking at this topic of how we cut emissions in the UK economy. And I've been doing this job for 3 years now. This has felt very much like the journey we've been on over the whole of that 3-year period. So in 2019, we advised on the new net zero target. We did a report on that, which led to the UK setting its long-term goal to net zero. And now this is the advice that we've offered on how to meet it. So from my perspective, that is much more interesting as a topic than just the long-term target itself. So let me take you through that today. And let me start with something that I don't always start with, but I've noticed increasingly that it's useful to do this. Just a reminder to you and to this audience, which I'm sure I don't need to make, but I will anyway, that we are now seeing climate change. And it's not something that's happening somewhere else. It is a real thing that we are experiencing here in the UK. Actually, in the UK, we have warmed more than the global average. So you can see that. This is a really nice graphic that we got from a piece of work that was done last year, just showing you how daytime temperatures have changed in recent years. And it is now a real factor. And I think this is something, to my mind, more and more people are waking up to. If I'd been doing this job in 2008 and we'd had a heat wave, then we might have struggled, I think, to comment on that heat wave, because there was always a question of attribution. Could you say that this was climate change with confidence? Well, now we don't need to do the attribution at all. It's someone else that does it for us, and that's typically the tabloid press. They are connecting together the changing climate with what's causing that. Obviously, our greenhouse gas emissions. And we are doing something quite extraordinary to the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We have that record. You can look at it going right back over nearly 1 million years. You can see it in the ice core data. The bubbles in those ice cores will show you that we have not been at this concentration of CO2 in the global atmosphere for a very, very long time, and certainly not since humans have been roaming the Earth. And it is pretty troubling when you know that there is a near linear relationship between the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature here on the planet. So in the UK, we are now seeing that manifest. Summer temperatures regularly now over 35 degrees centigrade in the southeast, which you can really see on this map. We've warmed the global atmosphere. Global temperatures have grown by about 1 degree centigrade since the Industrial Revolution. Actually, it's about 1.2 here in the UK. And that's leading to more and more extreme temperature changes here in the UK, never mind elsewhere. So heavier rainfall we're seeing, 10 to 25% chance each year of the kind of heat wave we had in 2018. That used to be just a few decades ago, less than 10% each year. So it's really changing, and we're not well adapted to those kind of temperatures. So that is going to be an increasing feature, I think, of the discussion. Now, one of the pieces that we did was one of the pieces of work that we did was just to pull out the latest information, looking at the 2030 commitments that we can see in the NDCs, the national determined commitments that we've got for the UN process. And interestingly, if you plug those in, despite all the great ambition and optimism there is, I pick up at the moment, we are still on course. If you look at those 2030 emissions reductions, for something between 3 and 4 degrees centigrade of warming by the end of this century. Now, that is difficult, actually, to describe in its impacts. But the point I'd like to make today is that is absolutely the case. But when we began our job just 10 or so years ago, we were on course for something much more than that. So although 3 to 4 degrees centigrade is a pretty dreadful outcome, it used to be much more. And that is testament to the progress that is happening in the global economy on decarbonising, partly about policy, but a lot about innovation and a lot about technological development, which we will talk about today. But if you hoover up those 2030 commitments that we have at the moment, that's where you get to. And of course, the question is, what do we do about that? And the answer to that is that we need a global approach to greenhouse gas emissions and to cutting them to the global goal of net zero. It's a scientific goal as well as being this slogan now that it has really become in commerce and amongst the discussion of policy and government. And this is the chart that we did in 2019. It's still valid. The pandemic broadly keeps us on track with this. This is what we need to do with greenhouse gas emissions over the course of the remainder of this century. The black line historically shows you we've been heading in the wrong direction in terms of global emissions of greenhouse gases. And you can see here the pathways that we think are consistent with Paris Agreement temperature goals. So the red line there, 2 degrees centigrade. The purple line, 1.5 degrees. And interestingly, what this chart shows you is that on that pathway, on the shape of that chart, we need to get to a global goal of net zero sometime in the 2070s. Again, that's on an all greenhouse gas basis. We would be getting to net zero for CO2 only earlier than that. But what that shows you is that we need to pull off this almost handbrake turn in global emissions. And I am optimistic we can do that. One of the reasons is because countries like the UK are now increasingly signing up to that net zero goal and doing so at a date that is in advance of that 2070 date. I don't know whether we can stay on track for 1.5, because of course the shape of the chart is as important as the date of net zero. But I do think it's important that the UK and others set these goals in advance of when the world needs to get there, and then point the way with strategies to get to net zero as quickly as possible. And that was the logic of what we said in 2019. After that, happily, I think we were able to be part of the effort to make it safer for other countries to name their net zero dates, including very swiftly after the UK, France. That helped immensely with the EU's own ambitions. Now the US and China in and some of the big Asian economies too. So there is a real feeling of momentum when we look at those mid-century net zero goals. I think what we need to be focusing on more now is the interim, the short term, the 2030s, and what we do to stay on track to a chart that looks similar to the one that you see here. And that's really what we were doing in our most recent work published in December on the 6th carbon budget. We'll talk about that in a second, but this is the implication of that rapid decarbonisation that we see. If we see that globally, is that we can stay in that corridor between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. And we could possibly stay on track for 1.5, although I think that is going to be extremely difficult if we see a rebound in emissions following the pandemic. We might talk about that in the questions later, but this is what we could win, I suppose, if things go well and we see that kind of rapid response that is implied by the Paris Agreement, and hopefully is where we are heading with the various national and corporate commitments that we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, let's talk about the path for the UK, and that's been the most important piece of work for us, something I expect we'll be talking about for a good while longer yet. So I wanted to start with a table. It doesn't look very exciting, but really is at the core of what we've been doing in the CCC over the last couple of years in developing these pathways to get to net zero. And we wanted to build those pathways around a very real world constraint, which is the asset lives, the useful economic life of assets that we use today. So if you were to buy a fossil fueled asset today, it would probably last for between 15 and 20 years. And you can see some of the lifetimes here on this chart. We've got a longer one in the report that we published in December. But the clue here is that we need to stop thinking about 2050 and start thinking about a date much sooner than that, and that's 2030. So we just knock 20 years off that statutory net zero date. 2030 is the date by which we need to stop selling high carbon assets and start selling and purchasing and using zero carbon assets. It's slightly earlier in some sectors, slightly later in others in our assessment, but 2030 is really the core date. And that's the date that we need to pull that achievement off if we want to get to net zero without stranding lots of assets, without that process of scrapping capital assets, which tends to carry very poor support, and I have to say tends to be expensive for the exchequer if there's a financial incentive to do that. So what we're trying to advise on is a path to net zero with the minimum of fuss. And actually asset lives really comes into view as being one of the key determinants of a well-planned transition over time. So that has been a kind of key thing in the work that we've done recently. And we developed 5 separate scenarios for getting to net zero. I'm not going to take you through them all today, but just to say that each one of those scenarios that you see here is designed to be an illustration of how the UK could get to net zero. The 3 that you see here, the headwind scenario, the engagement scenario, and the innovation scenario, are each designed to be illustrative of a different path to get to net zero. Each of them gets them under their own steam, but point to a very different scenario in each case. Headwinds is a world where things don't go very easily for the UK. So we have a lot of centrally planned infrastructure. We're using a lot of carbon capture, a lot of hydrogen produced through carbon capture as well as a replacement for natural gas over the course of the transition. It's the red line there. The engagement scenario is a really interesting one. That's a world where we see more behaviour change, so people are more responsive to the need to decarbonise. For a while, we really struggled to get that scenario to meet net change is important, but in the long run is not the primary determinant of achieving net zero, but more on that later. And innovation is the really interesting one for me. That's a world where we have a cheap power price, so we've got cheap electricity being produced, and then lots of electrified technologies using it, of course, without producing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a good and interesting scenario if you're at all interested in how things could go if the innovation process picks up pace. So we're seeing much more adoption of new technologies there. And then we've got a really controversial and interesting thing for us is we tried to build a scenario that essentially takes the best of all 3 worlds there and gets to net zero early in the early 2040s. And interesting to me, it only shaves 8 years off the statutory goal, despite it being a highly optimistic scenario. So I think a clue there that 2050 is a stretching target. And the most interesting thing for me is if you look across those 4 scenarios, despite the fact that they're all very different, the shape of the chart looks very similar. So it's this kind of inverted S shape, which you'll see in our recommended pathway here. So this is the core chart for us, the one that we've been talking a lot about over the last month. You can see the historical position on UK emissions in black. The past carbon budgets, which we set every 5 years under the Climate Change Act, carbon budgets 1 and 2, which have now passed and which were met. The legislated carbon budgets in blue there, 3, 4, and 5. And 6 is the one that we're recommending in the period 2033 to 37. And the implication of the 6th carbon budget recommendation is that we have to cut emissions by almost 80% by 2035. And just a couple of years ago, that was the statutory target for 2050. So the headline here, I suppose, is that the implication of setting a net zero goal by 2050 is that we've got to bring forward the old 80% target by 15 years, in effect, to be on course for net zero. You see that S shape again, that S shape, which starts with a plateau in emissions reduction, and then strongly falls over the 2030s before it flattens out over the 2040s. And that is that tells a story really about what the UK has done and what needs to do next. We have been doing well in decarbonising the power sector. It gives you those rapid reductions in emissions if you close a coal-fired power plant. There's not many of them left. We have been doing less well in scaling up the ambition in other sectors. That will take time. So we've got to scale up the ambition across the economy before we then see the payoff in emissions reduction over the 2030s. And I'm going to talk you through that today. And the other thing just to point out is that we also advised on the UK's NDC, the nationally determined contribution that we are making to the Paris process. We said at least 68%. You'll see it on the purple path there. And the Prime Minister agreed to that before Christmas. So that is a clue, I hope, that the government will accept our recommendation. They're not required to do so, but they must legislate for a 6th carbon budget before June this year. And I very much hope they'll follow our advice. It would be a bold government that would choose not to do so in the year that it hosts the next major climate summit, but we shall see. So let's move on. And just to say now something about how we deliver that kind of outcome. Now, the path is a front-loaded path. So if you were to divide up the emissions reductions that we're advising over the next 30 years into 2 halves, 15-year chunks, it would be a 60-40 split. So 60% of the emissions reductions happen in the first half of the transition, 40 in the second half. We think that's really important. It's a front-loaded strategy because we need to front-load the investment. That's a very sensible thing to do as we come out of the recession and the economic crisis that's accompanied the pandemic. But it's also important because we are opening up the options by going early. So we're not in this discussion saying that we have the perfect prescription for getting to net zero. We need to start early and see what happens, open up optionality as much as possible. That's a core part of what the CCC advises on. And the other thing that we're doing by going early is minimizing the cumulative contribution to the problem of climate change itself. So that chart, that path that you can see there, you can see on this chart, and this shows you how the emissions abatement is made up. So at the top of this chart, you can see the line that would be the outcome if we could imagine a world where we stopped climate policy tomorrow. That's the outcome that you would have as a baseline. We measure against that baseline to the purple line, this is the recommended path here. And broadly, what you see in terms of emissions abatement is that there are 4 things that we need to do to achieve net zero by 2050 on time. Number 1 is demand reduction and efficiency, which is an obvious thing to say. So using fewer fossil fuels over the short term, being more resource efficient over the short term. And you'll see that by the long term, it's not contributing as much as the others, but in the short term, it's actually making up the lion's share of the emissions reductions that we need to achieve over the coming 5 to 10 years. Then we pick up the slack with number 2, which is taking up low carbon solutions. This is really the most important element of the overall strategy for net zero. And the most important of those things is electrification of the economy. So this is all the electric cars that we'll need, all the heat pumps that we'll need to heat buildings in the UK. We've got a bit of hydrogen in there too. It is very much a complement to electrification, and a bit of CO2 capture in industry as well. The blue bit is finishing the job really of decarbonising our power sector, also producing low carbon hydrogen. You can see the wedge there as it grows. And the green bit is the reminder, I suppose, that this isn't just an energy story. So it's this is the natural carbon storage, the changes in land that allow us to sequester carbon, ultimately to use some of those bioresources in the energy process as well. So that's the broad plan. Another interesting take on it is this one. We did this in the Net Zero report in 2019, and people absolutely loved this chart, so we wanted to do it again. This is just a pie chart showing you the mix of technological change and behaviour change that goes with those emissions reductions that I've just talked about. Fascinating to me. So we're looking out to 2035 here in the middle of the sixth carbon budget period. About 2/5 of the emissions reductions that we are suggesting and recommending are what you might call as pure technology shift. So fuel switching, closing power plants. The rest of it involves an element of behaviour change or societal shift. And the most important and most interesting of those things is the pink wedge here, which is where we see a combination of behaviour change and technological shifts. And I find this to be by far the most interesting part of the journey that's ahead of us. All sorts of things that jump out at me when you look at this chart. This is the kind of classic changes that we've been advising for a while. So changing your vehicle to be an electric vehicle or changing your gas boiler to being a heat pump, classic kind of example of what we're talking about here. They are a behavior change. They're nothing that I feel particularly afraid of or scared of, but of course we will not be successful in this transition unless we start the discussion about what those lifestyle changes will be, and indeed what the benefits of those lifestyle changes are beyond just helping with the climate. So real strong clue that policy needs to think about engaging people more directly in that discussion. I think we will be in an interesting discussion about the role of place in some of those changes. So how might the changes in my hometown of Glasgow play out, and how can we involve people in the building the public consent for some of those changes as well? So all of that's hidden in this pie chart, really interesting. And then there's a massive policy challenge that goes with this. And this is another piece that we've done in the most recent report, giving our advice on the policies that will lead to that outcome that I've just described to you. And it is unprecedented. We are in the midst of something really quite remarkable in terms of the breadth of policy development that is now happening across the piece, really, not just in not just in Whitehall, not just in Westminster, right across the country. 300 local authorities now have declared some sort of climate emergency, although I should say that 300 local authorities definitely do not have a unified strategy for dealing with the climate emergency. We see devolved policies now picking up a lot of the slack as well. And a lot of that has been promised before we host the COP at the end of this year. Really quite amazing amount of things that have been promised by the Boris Johnson government in particular. And if I just scroll on, you can see we're already starting to tick some of those things off the list, which is good. So when it comes to this year, giving our usual annual progress update to Parliament, what I hope we'll be able to say is that when we look across the various strategies and consultations and plans that are now in gestation or out in the wild, we will hopefully be able to say this year that it is sufficient to meet the carbon budgets that are now legislated. But a crucial condition is that it may be sufficient if the numbers are there and big enough, but we have to actually deliver those numbers. So moving the story on from policy development onto policy delivery and actual emissions reduction and delivery on the ground is the big task. And what we said in our most recent report is that broadly the challenge is to scale up those policies over the 2020s to get to the point by around 2030 when we start the rollout across the economy of the assets and technologies that will deliver net zero in earnest. The electric cars, the changes in industry that we'll need to see. And you can see that broadly here. This is the policy challenge in a nice summary. But that kind of idea of the 2020s being the moment for policy and the 2030s being the period of real delivery is absolutely at the heart of what we've advised most recently. So scaling up and rolling out being the kind of the key things here over the course of the next 20 years, looking at that 20s, and 2030s ambition. The last thing I'll say is that over the 2030s, we will achieve some pretty interesting milestones. Again, working with the that idea of asset turnover and avoiding capital scrappage as much as possible. I'll just pull out a few of those dates. So 2030 is the date that the Prime Minister has signed us up to phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel cars. Well, we have it in 2032. We're talking about all cars there, including hybrids. So broadly, the government is in line with us now. 2033 is the date that we are suggesting the sale of gas boilers to homes and businesses should be phased out. That is going to be one of the key questions for policy and for ministers in this Parliament, possibly the next parliament. Can they sign up to something like that and maintain the public support for it? I think they can, but they need to build the case that this is an integrated and holistic strategy that we've got across the economy, crucially one that has jobs attached to it. So many of the things that we might have thought of as being difficult, I think will need to be framed up as being opportunities. And the one that I would pull out that really stands out, and controversial as it is that gas boiler rollout, that gas boiler phase out rather. We need to retrofit every building across the UK over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. We estimate that is that process of retrofitting plus installing low carbon heat will be a major new growth area for employment. So something of the order of 200,000 new jobs in that sector alone. Of course, they're spread right across the economy, right across the country. So really interesting to think about those industry challenges that go with that. 2035 is the other date I'll just pull out. That's the date that we think we should phase out unabated gas for electricity generation. Also the date that Joe Biden has signed up to for the US. And also the date that we need to move away from ore-based steel making using high carbon fossil fuels to something near zero emissions. So big challenge for industry. A big challenge there that needs to. The big challenge, of course, is that industry must be protected from some of those costs, or we will see carbon leakage. We will lose those industries to other parts of the world that are not on such an ambitious journey. So lots to say there. And in the final section, I just want to talk about some of the exciting stuff that sits behind that, and in particular, the impact of innovation. So this is a nice chart that we've updated a couple of times now in our work in CCC recently. And this just looking across global actual data from auctions of the cost of electricity, and really interesting and exciting change, really, which is fundamental to the advice that we've been giving and the optimism that we now have for how quickly this transition could happen. The alternatives to using fossil fuels in the power system are now as cheap or cheaper in actual auctions that are happening today. Now that is brilliant. It's a big story of disruption, of course, for the energy sector. It allows us to be confident that cheap power that we will need to electrify the economy will be there. No reason to think that innovation process is going to stop. The things that lie behind that are the astonishing story on solar and the astonishing story here in the UK on wind, and especially offshore wind, and the really remarkable cost falls, which of course we were predicting, but even we weren't predicting that they could happen at the scale that we've seen. So really exciting to see that. Now, it's a recipe for disruption in energy. It's also a recipe for disruption in the automotive sector. So we've looked at that too. We are very conservative on this. I'm happy to say that I think we will be overly conservative on it, but we are saying confidently that the price tipping point for the rollout of electric vehicles versus continuation of sales in petrol and diesel cars, the price tipping point is around the late 2020s. So it'll be cheaper for the economy at that point to switch to electric vehicles. It will probably be sooner than that. And indeed, when you look at the phase-out dates, the earlier the better, really, for the economy, because it's a net saving to the economy over time. Now, when you plug all that in together, what we can do now, which we were never able to do before, and it's very exciting to have this information, is that we can actually look at a profile of the investment necessary to get to net zero. And it is actually an investment story. It is mainly about CapEx. It is mainly about turning over the capital stock of the economy. We need to scale up from spending about £10 billion per year at the moment on CapEx for decarbonisation, mainly in the power sector. We need to scale that up from where we are today to about £50 billion per year. So CapEx of £50 billion a year, most of that private investment, of course, across the economy, and then maintain it to 2050. You can see how that's made up. It's mainly about the investment in the power system, investment in buildings, something we're not doing very much of right now, and investment in surface transport, and the networks that underpin that network investment is a meaningful part of that overall mission. And the green bit you see at the top there is industry investment as well. So substantial amount of CapEx going into those 5 challenges, and that buys us net zero in effect. But it also delivers a very significant saving to the economy over time. So this is the more efficient electrical devices, mainly, also hydrogen, but more efficient electrical devices, especially, that we're using now extensively across the economy, spending less on fossil fuels. It's quite resilient to a change in the fossil fuel price, we think. That overall, what you see here is that the savings over time start to cancel out the actual investment costs. And that has pretty deep implications for the overall aggregate cost of the transition, which we now think is much less than 1% of GDP throughout the transition, which is exciting to be able to talk about. That masks, of course, the fact that although the aggregate cost is now low, there are still very big and important cost challenges within that. So real costs that we will see, particularly in the buildings decarbonisation challenge, also in the industry challenge. We need to, in effect, spread some of the benefits from this. You can see the purple section is the surface transport saving I was talking about just a second. We need to spread those benefits into those sectors where there are real costs, and we will need fiscal policies to support all of this. So the fact that the Treasury is looking at all that is very exciting. And the last thing I just wanted to say is just a kind of recap really on what we will be bringing to COP if those recommendations are accepted by the government. And a really nice chart, this, which I've been using a bit recently. Just looking, this is the same chart I showed you at the top of this presentation on the global challenge. This is global emissions per capita and the requirements of Paris that you see there. So largely a flat line actually over since 1990 on a per capita basis, which is in itself surprising. We need to bring those emissions down to net zero, of course, over the course of the next 30, 40, and 50 years. But when you look at it on a per capita basis, the nice thing I can do is just show you the implication of the UK story on a per capita basis overlaid on top of that global story. And really interesting, the UK has halved its its emissions per head. It used to be double the global average back in 1990. We're now at the global average. And if you follow that purple line there, you'll see that we do, I'm afraid, stay above the 2-degree line over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. Then we cross the red and the green lines there until by 2035, we're underneath the 1.5-degree line. And of course, we hit net zero early. And I think that is a good story of progress, something that we should be able to bring to Paris as being a meaningful route map, I suppose, for other economies in similar positions to follow. I really hope it is, because I think the COP this year could be a real jamboree, a real kind of moment of optimism if we can bring that about. So Cameron, I'll stop there. I've probably gone over, but I hope that was interesting.
No, you're great. Thank you, Chris. And I like Glasgow as a site for a moment of jamboree-style optimism. It's kind of what we need. The Glaswegians are famously known for their optimism and good humour. But thank you for everything you've done with the CCC. And I think this shows, indeed, why it's no surprise that there are many countries around the world that are looking at the UK's experience with the CCC and thinking we'd like a bit of that too. And while they can't have Chris, they can and they are setting up their own committees. A few big takeaways from me from your talk before we get to the questions. Now, I actually was kicking myself after introducing you because I forgot to let everybody know that there is the Ask a Question button on the bottom right-hand corner. But as it is, we've already had 26 questions. So I'm kind of, in retrospect, that's probably a good thing. But I personally enjoyed the chart on which is tech, which is behavior change, which is combined. We've been having a bit of a spat within our research group's chat function on this exact question. I was pleased to see you refer to the attribution of extreme events, although I think my colleagues Freddie Otto, Rupert Stewart-Smith, Tom Wetzer and Miles Allen would have something to say about the tabloid press being the arbiters of that and not their science. And I think the points you made around asset lifetimes, it's just really, really important that we think in that way to minimize those capital costs, which at 60 billion a year, even with all of the OPEX savings, these are not trivial costs. Just to put it into perspective, there are 60 million of us here in this country. That's £1,000 per person per annum. But as Chris said, and as we put in our report, at the end of the process, you get a situation where you've built out all of this infrastructure and almost runs for free. So I like the phrase, the Victorians of the 21st century there. But yeah, there are lots of questions, 26, 27 of them. Chris, they range from, just to give you a sense of the range, and they're being voted on and the rest of us, but should we have Downing Street briefings like we do with COVID on climate? What are your hopes for COP26, which you've noted there? Probably the biggest one, asked multiple ways, upvoted, is what the hell are we doing with this coal mine in Whitehaven? We know you had words with the PM on this, but what's the actual answer? Should we be doing electric arc steel making? Should we be doing a carbon take back obligation where you can extract your metallurgical coal, but you've got to stick the CO2 back underground? So what's the answer there? How do we think about key industries and their regulation? Where's all this electricity going to come from? Were the courts right to hold Macron to account to fail to mitigate enough for the French? Do we still need XR and Greta, or are you kind of on the case now? What do we do about the shipping industry, where actually we kind of need these new clean assets basically right away, but we don't have them? Through to national speed limits. Should we stop flying? What do we do with the future home standards? What's the role for bioenergy? What's the role for nuclear? How about insulation and heat and embodied emissions and international? So the full set of questions is there for you.
Yeah.
I might decide, my joy as chair is I get to kind of filter these a little bit, but also everybody whose question isn't answered then gets pissed off. Excuse my Australian language. But I'm going to start with the coal mine. What are we doing in Cumbria?
Well, I don't know what we're doing. It's insane. So, I mean, the kind of work we did, it's really interesting for us because we're not a regulator. So we didn't respond immediately when Robert Jenrick decided not to call in the planning consent that had been offered by the council. But I don't mind saying I felt personally that it was something. It was important for us to say something about it. Now, the argument that has been made by the developer is that they will substitute perfectly for what would otherwise be imported coal. The argument that we've run is, well, that's rubbish, because we know that by adding to the supply of coal, we will almost certainly reduce the price of it, and therefore we will be using more coal in the round. It's worth saying it's a particular type of coal, so it's a coking coal that's being used here. So it's different from the stuff that we'd be using in a thermal power plant, for example. And I understand that. So we thought carefully and deeply about it, but still felt that it was in the round a silly thing to consent it. And one of the main reasons for that is that in the advice that I've just talked about, we are projecting from 2035 onwards that we have to have a different outlook on steelmaking. So there are lots of routes to achieving lower and zero carbon steelmaking in the UK. We should be pursuing them. It might involve carbon capture. It might more notably involve hydrogen. But either way, it doesn't make sense for the UK to open up new resources of coal, and we know that the task here is to keep it in the ground as much as possible. So we felt we wanted to say something about that. It is not formally our job, especially on a project by project basis, to act as a regulator. So what we're talking about in that letter is more of a strategic discussion of the need for the coal, of those sort of the use of those resources, and the need for the UK to have them directly. And I suppose we're putting a line in the sand about the importance of how it looks. It's just a bad look for the UK to be opening new coal mines. Now, it's a controversial thing for us to do that, so we thought carefully about it. But there is a real head of steam behind it now. So I'm fascinated to see, even in the FT today, that the FT's adopted a position on it along with many others. So it feels more and more like it's broadened into the the public discourse more generally, and I'd be fascinated to see what the Prime Minister does about it.
Yeah, it's going to be a tricky one for him because, of course, there are jobs associated with the mine, and it's an area where they need the jobs, and they're actually, as I understand it, very strongly locally in favour of it. So it's kind of some of these trade-offs are being hit. We're being hit with them quite early in this particular case, and lest anybody be confused, there's no head of steam going on here because it's not for the production of electricity, this coal mine. Anyway, moving on, PM has said, so that was Steve Smith's question. Moving on to Daniel Schaaf's question, the PM said that climate is more serious than COVID. So should we be having key climate scientists and other scholars, you perhaps, standing up there on the podium with Boris or future prime ministers, giving, if not a daily update, then perhaps a quarterly update on progress on climate? What do you think?
No, I don't. I'd rather not. I mean, I think it would be good if there was, more of that top level communication of what is going on in terms of the policies that the UK is developing. And of course, I would love to see better coverage of the science of climate. And I have to say, to be honest, we're seeing a bit of that. But this is maybe a controversial thing to say, I don't know. But of course, this is a crisis. Climate change is a crisis, and so too is the pandemic. But they are very different in their nature, and I fully understand the need for daily briefings on the pandemic. I think it is less the case that we should have that kind of frantic political focus on climate. I'd rather that we focused on building a genuine, sustainable strategy for dealing with emissions in the UK. And I have to say that my hope is that we are doing just that at the moment. So, I'm quite happy to not appear on a podium next to the Prime Minister for now, because the commitments that he has put in his 10-point plan and his energy white paper, which is largely a sort of umbrella for a set of other strategies that will need to come next. If he pulls all of that off, then I very much hope, I mentioned this, I very much hope that by the time we come to do our next set of appraisals of progress, we'll be saying something new, which is broadly that the ambition's in the right place, but we need to see it delivered. And I'd much rather talk about delivery than I would the need for gaps in strategy. So I think we're almost at that point. That's quite exciting to be able to say that.
Okay, well, I'm sure there'll be some disappointed people there who are looking for the climate briefing. Certainly, I think the point to take home, those in the audience online there, is that Chris agrees, as do I think many of us, that this issue needs a much stronger and more regular public profile, whether it's frenetic chief medical officer sort of briefings or otherwise, we're not sure. Okay, moving along.
I don't know who our Chris Whitty would be. I don't think.
Well, perhaps this is the issue, actually. And for those interested, there's a whole section of the Policy Advisory Group's report to the Committee on the Climate Change Committee that Giles Wilkes from the Institute of Government was, in large measure leading, talking about how you reorganise government so that there is a Chris Whitty for climate. Because we currently don't have the architecture that you probably need to put the country on this kind of delivery, not quite wartime footing, but near wartime footing to get the job done. So,
and I totally agree with that. I mean, I inputted into the piece of work that the Institute for Government did on this last year, and that another interesting development there is that the Institute for Government for years didn't ever look at these issues. I don't think they really regarded it as a major dynamic in government. Now has really picked that up. And I completely agree. And there is the 10th point of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan was this task force, which I have to say many people in my circle didn't expect to see in that plan. But he's putting together changes in some of the Whitehall architecture, which again are quite exciting if we can pull that off.
Yeah.
And we'll need to see what happens with them.
Great. Well, let's move from the domestic to the international now. So Chris Church has the next most upvoted question on COP26. So what are your hopes in particular, thinking about Article 6, what prospect do we have to accelerate action, do you think?
Yeah, so the COP it's fascinating how uncertain the objectives are for COP at the moment. So I get the sense that, and I should say I'm not formally part of the COP process at all, but of course I'm close to people who are. But I do get the sense that the pace of optimism that has kind of come along, even in the midst of a pandemic, there's just this really real kind of movement now towards especially these net zero goals by mid-century, which wasn't there, let's say, 18 months ago. If you'd asked me 18 months ago, I might have felt pretty pessimistic, actually, about the ability of the COP to inject much more optimism, certainly not the kind of thing that we saw in Paris. Well, now I think that's changed. So this kind of the backdrop to this is a lot of ambition and progress. Again, controversially, a lot of this is to do with Donald Trump, I think. Actually, it's a reaction to the kind of Trump outlook on climate.
So we should thank the Donald, should we?
He's the greatest environmentalist of our generation. Believe me, I don't think that. But the reaction to that has helped, I think, in many ways. So we've got this momentum now that we didn't have before. I am certain that the COP will be still largely, in terms of the top level diplomacy, we'll still be talking about net zero as being, one of the key strap lines to the COP in Glasgow this year. But we've got to move it on from just that. Yeah. So the two things I'll just pull out, maybe three things actually. One is that, of course, the UN process is focused on national commitments. That's the Paris mechanism. But I suspect they will disappoint. So there's another interesting dynamic playing out, which is if you look through those national commitments into what's happening in the global economy, you can pull out 5, 6, maybe 7 global transitions that we see in commerce globally, which I think will be much more important ultimately in driving us towards the Paris goals, and which you can see a much more optimistic story playing out. I've talked about a few of them in my presentation today, but obviously moving off coal is one, moving towards renewables is another. But the really interesting things are definitely in the automotive sector, the move to electric vehicles, heating and cooling in buildings, and industrial decarbonisation along with CCS, and possibly hydrogen as well. These things transcend the national boundaries, and I think point to an area where, at least if the COP president wishes to do so, we may be able to pull out a more optimistic story of progress than you would see in the NDCs themselves. The NDCs are still important, but then that remains to be seen whether we'll have those 2030s NDCs in line with, I think it's more likely we'll have net zero goals than it is that we'll have lots of ambition in 2030. The other thing, kind of the last thing I might say, is that it's the privilege of the privilege of the president to set the agenda. And we saw when France did that they provide a really strong chair for the COP. The UK can determine what it wants to do in the COP, and it doesn't need to be bound by the need to finish Article 6 or some of the things that have really blighted the most recent COPs and have made them appear to be mired. So I think one of the questions is what it puts on the agenda and determines for itself what the success measures will be. I don't know whether Article 6 can be sorted out. If I was in charge of that agenda, I would want that sorted out before the COP, if at all possible, so that you have a different kind of summit, one that's more like Paris. So I have to say I'm quite optimistic about all of that. I think Glasgow can be a real moment of optimism, because the other point about the COP this year is that it should be the point when we are properly emerging now from the crisis. And if the presidency of the COP is about lining up prior to COP the story of a green recovery, then we really could be in a moment of real optimism for the global economy, return to multilateralism. So I think all of that is in the mix. I'd love to tell you what the success measure is for COP, but I haven't got it yet.
Well, it actually leads rather nicely into the next question, which has been upvoted in a wave of new power movement sort of optimism. Do we still need XR and Greta? And are these sort of youth movements and other civil society-based climate movements a key part of driving faster action at COP?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are. I don't know whether we still need XR, but we still need those movements to be ahead of the kind of commitments that we might be advising. Otherwise, things are in the wrong order, I think. So it's useful to have those movements keeping the momentum heading in the right direction. I would love to see more of a focus on the short term from those movements. I'm absolutely bored to tears with discussing the date of net zero. I think it is a pointless discussion unless you can talk about what we're doing over the next decade. So I'd like to drill into the steps that will lead us to an earlier date. We tried to throw light on that in the 6th carbon budget work with the tailwind scenario that I talked about. I didn't go into any detail on that, but it gives you a sense of what you would need to see if you wanted an earlier net zero date. And of course, it rests on doing as much as possible in the short term. So it's difficult. I mean, I'm in no position to tell those civic groups what to do, but I would love it. I'd love to get beneath the net zero date discussion and into a more meaningful discussion about how you can drive change more rapidly in those sectoral changes that I've talked about. I mean, it's a tough ask, but it would be a much more effective strategy all around, I think.
Well, there you go, Tessa Hammond, and those who upvoted that question. There's some tips from Chris there, but I think, and if Tessa were here on stage, I'm sure she'd be asking about, well, could we not phase out all internal combustion engines by 2025 or 2022? So, but perhaps, as you say, that's a more useful conversation to have. You can start to talk about the feasibility of doing really aggressive action that way. Okay, next one is Steve Smith from the Smith School, as it happens, on scenarios that you've put up today. He asks about the surprises that might occur, because as you've said, the CCC and many others has been surprised in the past, tech progress moving faster than expected. What other surprises might there be out there? Now, you might say, well, they're captured in the headwinds, tailwinds, extreme scenarios, but could there be other kind of green swans or even, the opposite sort of swan? Let's not call them any color or even suggest they're from Western Australia. But anyway, it's just events that could drive things much, much, much more slowly or faster.
Yeah, there's lots. So, I mean, it's really important to say that we're not forecasting here. So what we're presenting is a set of steps and laying out policies to deliver those steps. And as you say, Steve, what we've tried to look at this year is much more focused on building scenarios so you can start to contemplate what would need to be in place to bring those scenarios about. A few things I might just pull out, and in no particular order. So, there are things that will move us more swiftly to the goal and things that will cause us to worry more about achieving it. The top worry I have actually is the ability of government to inspire all of this, because we do really need to see a decade ahead of us where the government is in the lead. I expect industry and commerce and indeed the consumer to pick up the pace after that, but a lot of this needs to be put in place by strong government policies over this parliament and the next. So that raises the prospect of, we always talk about market failure in this discussion, but there is a big prospect of government failure alongside that too. So, that is one of the big, I don't know what color of swan it is, but it's definitely something that has blighted other major projects that we face in the UK. But important to say, I don't think this is just a big procurement exercise. It's not like an HS2 or any of those big projects that typically attract, those IT projects that typically attract the ire of the press. We're talking about something that's much more atomized here. So there's a bit of that kind of centrally procured big outcome stuff still to do in the power sector, for example. I think probably the industry transition looks a bit like that too. So you can have policies made in Whitehall, and then the recipients of those policies tend to be big corporates that can act on them. We're quite good at those. So, they're the ones that we've had most success with in the UK. The ones that the rest of it you saw in that pie chart is a much more atomized, difficult, messy discussion about how you put the incentives in the right place so that millions of people respond in the right way. I think that's where the greatest danger lies to the transition. I would think there is potential to go even faster than what we've recommended. So I have to say I don't regard our scenarios as being optimistic. I think there's every possibility we could go faster than that. So one of the other conditions that may play out is that we might see a number of changes in the core prices of energy along the way. So for example, if you have the hydrogen price that we're assuming, then we reckon that would almost reduce the total cost, the aggregate cost, to zero over that period. Now you can imagine the incentive to go even faster that may come with that cheaper hydrogen price. And the other one, of course, is the power price. Difficult to predict any of that. And the third one, I'll just say, is the price of fossil fuels itself. So that we measure against, that is a key condition. If as the cost of fossil fuels falls, then so the relative cost of decarbonisation goes up. But we're pretty resilient to those kind of changes. So I'm excited about all of that. I think we've as ever we've been pretty conservative about some of those things. So what you see from us is a pretty prudent take on how we can get to net zero, albeit it rests on tough and ambitious policies over the next decade. If they're in place, then I think we can do it, and I'm pretty confident about that.
Okay, as ever, a balanced answer from Chris there. We're moving along. The next triumvirate of questions are all relating to heating and boilers and houses, and we have a total of 14 votes for the top three questions here. So we want your thoughts on fabric improvements, insulation measures in homes and buildings as part of the heating story, on licensing conditions for new builds, making sure that developers don't just put up stock now with gas boilers and rubbish insulation, and also retrofitting of own homes. How do we just roll that out, and can we make it a condition for any extensions or any developments of any kind? And then a very specific question: should we bring forward the Future Home Standard to 2023? So thoughts on housing and heating, please.
Yeah, so this is the biggie for me. I mean, the question of whether we make it on time rests largely on whether we get serious about heat decarbonisation. And we've been pretty pretty spiky in this report, actually, about what we need to do overall to achieve that heat decarbonisation on time. And maybe worth saying, I think there's a few things that play into this. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because we're not just talking about cleaning up the supply of the heat. We're also talking about, changing demand and changing the fabric of the building stock that we have in the UK. And there's lots of debates about the extent to which you can do that and do it successfully and on time. We are very clear that we don't have the answer to this. So what we need to be doing is keeping options open through the 2020s, deploying where we can the low regret solutions early. So typically that's the off gas communities where we don't have big decisions about network assets to make. So getting on with off gas properties and decarbonising them quickly is a big part of our analysis. And then moving to key decision points over the 2020s and keeping options open, including potentially this hydrogen option, which the government at the moment seems to be very keen on. Most of the ultimate decarbonisation of heat comes through the use of heat pumps in our assessment, and that is in itself a very controversial thing to do. So what we've advised is that actually the most important thing is not to fuss about what the eventual outcome is, not the what, but instead the how. So providing, I think, 4 things. Firstly, a clear direction for what the government plans to do. It's really important that there is a strong sense so that consumers, citizens know what's coming, and crucially the installer industry knows what's coming too, and the construction sector. So a clear direction, which has worked very, very well in those areas where we have been successful in the UK in decarbonising, crucially the power sector. Everyone knows where they stand on coal now. That's a really important part of it. So being clear about what the objectives are and when we will get there. That was a big part of our assessment in saying that 2033 was the date we had to stop selling gas boilers. So providing that strong signal that we need to get to that outcome, and then opening up the options and opening up the development of the options over the course of the next 10 years. Secondly, you're going to have to make low carbon more financially attractive. So, that's a big fiscal question there for the Chancellor about what he does about, we see it in the speculation in the press this week about the inbuilt penalty for using electricity versus natural gas, for example, that's in the tax system. Whether you can address some of that balance is a key and interesting factor of the transition overall. Thirdly, we do need enabling measures. So we need, in particular, plans, real plans to start on this process. We need those plans almost locale by locale. So I'm a big fan of regional energy planning when it comes to the heat decarbonisation story. We will need to know what towns and cities plan to do so that network investment, apart from anything else, can be planned around it. So actually starting the process of local area energy planning is a really good enabler. And the other part here is the green building passports that go with that. Understanding genuinely what the energy performance and carbon performance of buildings in the UK is a big step to enabling a lot of this to take place. And then lastly, we've just got to get on with it. And we've got to stop talking about it. And that does ultimately rest, I think, on tackling the biggest underpinning challenge here, which is the fact that the built environment that we have is not energy efficient at the moment. Yeah. We will make the problem too big of decarbonising those buildings if we don't start acting soon on making them more energy efficient. So I was really pleased to see that one of the measures the Chancellor agreed to fund in the midst of the pandemic last year was the Green Homes Grant. But you see immediately the problems of that. It's run into lots of problems in the way that it's being rolled out in the UK because it wasn't the time to put in place the right measures for the installer community to then roll that measure out on behalf of government. So I hope that gets a bit longer, and I hope we get to the point where we can have a sensible discussion about how we make those buildings more energy efficient over time, and how we understand where the limits of that strategy might lie. We've got to start with that before we understand the extent of the challenge of decarbonising the buildings. But that's where the jobs are. So for me, the exciting story is to turn this into some council of despair and instead to make this the big opportunity-laden discussion. This is something that's going to happen in every town across the UK. So local jobs will be a big part of that story if the public consent for that is going to be built. The last thing I'll say on this is that one of the really interesting processes I took part in last year was the climate assembly process that was inspired by Parliament. So we had 6 select committees who procured a citizens' assembly on how to reach net zero, and this was one of the key discussion points with that group of people. And interesting to me, I mean, we went through all of the technological options, the kind of format wars. Is it hydrogen? Is it heat pump? what should we do about it all? They didn't care about that really. They weren't interested in it. They were happy that there were a range of options to decarbonise buildings. Happy too that there were options for making those buildings more energy efficient. What they wanted was a stake in the decision. They wanted to have some sense that there was a plan in the community that they live in, that they'd had an opportunity to look at and have a discussion about. And I think that opens up a really interesting point about my earlier point about planning this properly. I think that might be the key enabler to getting going on this quickly, is to start to open the discussion about what people want, building the public consent for it. There's loads there, but I mean, this is going to be the thing I suspect the CCC will be looking at most over the course of the next decade.
I'm pretty sure you're right about that. It's not an easy set of questions, and no surprise that we had a bunch of them at the top of the list. Now, we are out of time, which is a shame because we have 37 good questions lined up for you there. They just keep coming in. I was going to say, for those of you who want more information about the Post-Carbon Transition Programme, you can click a link at the bottom of the screen, but I see that's just cunningly been changed by forces out of my control to say, join me, Cameron Hepburn, on Monday to talk about sensitive intervention points. But have a look at post-carbon transition on the Oxford Martin School website. Chris, I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing your slides. Presumably we'll be able to post them up. Great. So a few people have wanted the slides. And of course, if you want the gory detail, I should say glorious detail, really. It's all on the Climate Change Committee website. So, Chris, thank you for joining us today, but actually more deeply and importantly, thank you for all the work that you and your very able colleagues, I've had the pleasure of interacting with many of them, just keep on doing for this country and actually by implication and by spillover effect for the whole world on this issue. Thank you very much. And thank you all for tuning in for what was a very, very insightful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.